They estimate that Zelensky alone has stolen $10 billion from Ukraine, constantly involving ourselves in Russia's affairs in Ukraine. We have a permanent interest in stirring up trouble in Central Asia.
Recently, Douglas Macgregor slammed the war in Ukraine, which continues on 6 months into Trump's presidency, and explains why it keeps continuing regardless of who occupies the White House. He also gets into Zelensky's growing unpopularity in Ukraine and the lack of morale among Ukrainian forces. Let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Today, I read a report that there have been massive demonstrations in Kiev against Zelensky and his government. And people who look at this superficially are saying, oh, look, the Ukrainians are finally turning against the war. Look, they've been against the war for a long time. The Ukrainian population wants nothing to do with this. What you're seeing is kind of a color revolution staged by the CIA, MI6, and Mossad in Kiev against Zelensky because they want to move him out. They want him to come out. Now, why they just don't arrest him, I don't know, because the same report said they estimate that Zelensky alone has stolen $10 billion from Ukraine. Now, where did that come from? Largely us. Okay. So this is one giant kleptocracy, and he is the chief crook in charge. That's why he just announced that he was dissolving this anti-corruption bureau, which was never very serious anyway. It was manned largely by us, and we were using it to exert control over the people in Ukraine who are oligarchs and inside the defense establishment and industry.
Well, I have a simple solution if you want to diminish Zelensky's political power, and that's to stop funding Ukraine to the tune of $200 billion, which the U.S. has already done. I tend to doubt the sense that they want Zelensky out. You know, Zelensky has been a friend of this administration and a friend of the Biden administration, despite all the theatrics, despite him going into the White House early on in Trump's second term and acting entitled to the Treasury and Trump kind of dressing him down. Well, that didn't seem to pan out tangibly when it came to policy. The U.S. froze funding for a little bit, then continued to resupply it. And, you know, if you really want to get that gorilla off your back, stop leaning into and siding with the military-industrial complex on every regard, regardless. Now, I do think that there probably is U.S. involvement in intelligence operations stirred up in Ukraine to some extent, for sure. But I think those operations would be designed to continue the war and to continue the Zelensky policy of trying to fruitlessly win back the Donbass, even though 85 to 90% of it's been occupied without real changes in a few years. So, you know, it's true that the U.S. does like to stir up turmoil overseas. It certainly did that in Kiev before in 2014 when it overthrew the Yanukovych government, but I don't know if they really want Zelensky out. You can diminish his power other ways.
I think they want to replace him with Zelensky, but at the same time, they're not paying attention to what's happening on the battlefield. The battlefield is changing. They are breaking through up and down the line, more recently in Prokhorovsk, and headed for Dnipro and other cities. You're going to see the Russians cross the river, I think, and go into Kiev itself. And then eventually down towards Odessa. I don't think they have any choice because we've made it impossible for them to work with us and reach a conclusion to this war because we refuse to recognize the legitimate nature of their security interests. In other words, imagine that we had a foreign army training Mexicans and people from El Salvador and Costa Rica and Honduras and a giant army in central Mexico for use against us, ostensibly. And they were starting to infiltrate our borders into New Mexico, where they probably will resonate with some of the local people, Southern California, Texas, Arizona. What would we do? Well, we would crush this mercilessly from the air and on the ground. And then we would say, we want it all gone, and we're not going to tolerate this any further. If you persist, we're going to march into Mexico.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. He's right about the general trajectory of this war, by the way. The last real Ukrainian offensive of any kind, I believe, was in the summer of 2024, and that offensive was basically completely pushed back by the beginning of 2025. Ukraine hasn't made any inroads at all, despite, the PR campaign that was, bombing Russia's nuclear bombers, which the Pentagon said they didn't know about, despite the fact that they're the ones that supply Ukraine with intelligence. They operate most of this war from a base in Germany that came out a few months ago, to the extent that more Americans, much more so than most Americans thought. And the fact that supposedly this operation took 18 months to develop, that is true. I don't know if Russia is going to be able to have the resources or the political will to drive toward Odessa. I think that some politicians in Russia certainly want that, and they think that that might be the only way to stop this war at this point, especially after the Trump administration campaigned on ending it, but had shown really no sign of truly desiring to end it and doing what it takes to end it, which means disengagement. That's not what the U.S. has done, despite opening up diplomatic channels with Russia. So I don't know if they will take Kiev. I tend to doubt that, but he's totally right about the general trajectory of this war, which is fruitless and senseless as Zelensky maintains power, without holding elections, citing, a clause in the Constitution that allows that during wartime, while he suppresses political dissidents, dissolves this anti-corruption agency that Macgregor talked about, banned Eastern Orthodox churches, expanding conscription laws, etc. This is the martial law presidency of Zelensky. He's not a pro-democratic by any stretch, despite all the propaganda that you heard about the U.S. being involved in Ukraine for democracy. It's a total sham.
And the American people would say, go for it, fix it, smash these people once and for all. Well, that's what's happened in Russia. So if we really want to end this war, and I think you're right, I don't think anybody really does, because too many people are profiting from it in Washington. And you have this sick, demented mentality that says Russia, because it is an Orthodox Christian country that is largely homogeneous, I think it has 20 million Muslims out of 140 million plus people living in it. So it's essentially a homogenous country with a strong culture. And by the way, the Muslims are integrated into that country, as we've seen with the Russian army. I mean, you can't find better fighters than the Chechens, who have shown up and fought the Ukrainians with a vengeance. So we apparently want to destroy that, just as we're angry with Hungary and angry with Slovakia and angry with Poland, because they don't want 100 million Africans or 100 million Arabs or 100 million of anything from outside their countries in their countries.
Yeah, that's right. And he's totally right about how the U.S. would respond if there were a battle on our border with land claims on both sides, and what we would do if Russia funded a proxy war in Mexico. And by the way, flirted with the, hey, Mexico, you're going to become part of our military alliance, so any attack against you will be a guaranteed hot war. That's exactly what NATO has done with regard to Ukraine and Russia, and that happened over periods of time, right? In Trump's first presidency, he supplied Ukraine with about $400 million worth of weapons, and the Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration at the Bucharest summit flirted with, well, not even flirted. They said Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. That's been continuing on and on and on. Trump supplied offensive weapons, including the Aegis missile systems that can launch offensive weapons, and we all know what happened with Biden, continued that policy to its maximum degree, funding them to the teeth, despite the fact that, again, there's no inroads on the battlefield. Ukraine isn't winning back this territory, and Ukraine did nothing to enforce the Minsk Accords. They never had any intention to do that. The Minsk Accords saying that, hey, you will deliver political autonomy to these Donbass provinces, to Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. That didn't happen, and it was supposed to happen constitutionally, granting them political autonomy, not unlike what Macau has in China, something like that. That arrangement never happened, and that's what sparked a civil war that began not in 2022, but in 2014, and the U.S. instigated it by overthrowing the democratically elected government of Ukraine under Yanukovych.
And I think that's important, because people say, well, we share values. People don't die for shared values. They died for their kin. for their friends. They don't die for shared values. That's all nonsense. Nobody died when I was in the Army fighting anywhere for the Constitution. I'm sorry. That's not it. You died because of the formation you were in with the people that you cared about, who are Americans like you, whom you trusted and loved and cared for. That's why. Our sense of community in the United States is weak. It needs to be restored. These are the things that President Trump should focus on, but I don't see him doing so.
Yeah, sure don't, especially when he decides to rearm Ukraine, going back against many of his campaign promises to say, over and over, whenever the situation with Ukraine would come up, he'd say, I just want people to stop dying. The slaughter is immense. It's insane. It's senseless. I want people to stop dying there. And that was good messaging. But guess what he's done while in office? He's maintained virtually the status quo Biden policies that ensure that people keep dying in the Donbass. And by the way, it might be over 1 million Ukrainians that have died in this war. There's lots of projections all over the place in that regard, but many of them are north of 1 million when it comes to Ukraine. And guess what? Putin really has no incentive to stop his policy of this war until the U.S. stops funding one side of it, until the EU countries stop funding one side of it. And by the way, if the U.S. disengages, the dominoes fall. I think the U.S. doing that would spur a total disinterest in the EU, whereas right now you have Merz and Starmer and Macron and von der Leyen and others, saying how much they want to not only continue this war, but exacerbate it and continue additional funding. Well, if the U.S. got out of there, I don't think you'd be seeing that rhetoric. I think a peace would be inevitable. Zelensky would have no choice. Otherwise, he'd have to surrender his entire regime. That's what.
And that's the problem.
Okay, just in our final minutes, let me clarify one thing. So CIA, MI6, they are trying to remove Zelensky, but even if they remove him, the plan is to keep the war going just with new leadership?
Yeah, well, you're going to bring in ostensibly this man, Zaluzhny from London. He was badly wounded. He was always viewed as more desirable and potentially more competent than Zelensky. But he's unacceptable. The Russians are never going to allow him to come in. That would have been similar to the government of Mexico telling us that, we know the last government failed, so now Pancho Villa is going to take over. Remember him? He was the guy that invaded the United States and attacked us in Arizona. Yeah. Now we want to put him in. It's not going to work. The Russians will never accept it. It's all fantasy world. But this is what we have to understand. We're not just constantly involving ourselves in Russia's affairs in Ukraine. We have a permanent interest in stirring up trouble in Central Asia. Azerbaijan is one of those places that's of great importance because it lies in the Caucasus, astride the major communications, transportation routes that are important to both Iran, Russia, China, and Central Asia, as well as the Turks and others in the region. We want to break everything up because we see this as foundational to BRICS. And we don't understand that we are putting ourselves in a very dangerous position. Trump needs to get us out. I don't care how much money Miriam Adelson or anybody else has given him. That's not our problem.
Yeah, man, I'm with Macgregor there. And I think these protests in Kiev are significant. They're the first huge-scale protests that have broken out in Ukraine since this war began against the Ukrainian government. It really has shown the dissension that's boiled up against Zelensky from many circles within Ukraine in the first time manifesting in such a way. And there always has been dissidents that didn't like Zelensky, that was more inclined toward a policy favored by people like Yanukovych. Of course, Yanukovych had his detractors domestically too. But guess what? The U.S. picked one side of that. And guess which side that was? It was the one more antagonistic toward Russia by far. That's which side it picked. That's what ushered in this illegitimate Ukrainian regime that was instituted by force. It was instituted by a coup, by the Maidan coup that the U.S. participated in under Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piat. There was even that leaked phone call where they talked about who had to be part of this new provisional government such that we could entangle ourselves in a new, bold alliance with this new Ukrainian government that was willing to rattle sabers with the world's biggest nuclear power in terms of the amount of nuclear warheads they have at their disposal, and that's Russia. Well, the key here, that's the real America First solution, is to get out of there. Don't let this drag on indefinitely, because this would be even more disastrous as a 20-year proxy war, as the Afghanistan and Iraq occupations, both of which dragged out about 20 years too. That's what the U.S. can't afford to bear, especially when in debt $37 trillion. So Trump's rhetoric on this during the campaign trail was actually pretty good, but does he ever put his best foreign policy rhetoric into practice? No, he virtually never does. And that's one of the sore spots that some of his supporters are pointing to, saying, hey, you didn't live up to these promises. Now, a lot of this is being drowned out right now by the Epstein story, the Epstein cover-up, which it really is, and the Russiagate revelations. But this is important too. And this is also something the administration wants to get away from when it comes to their base. But they do still want to obviously be involved in Ukraine. And Macgregor's right to say, hey, it's because of the military-industrial complex that this is still continuing. It is. They have an incredible stranglehold and lobbying power over our elected representatives and the deep state, and that remains regardless of who's elected. Whoever controls Congress or the House of Representatives or the presidency, it doesn't exactly matter as long as that lobby remains. Same with the Israel lobby. He made reference to Adelson, but the Israel lobby actually favors U.S. intervention in Ukraine too, I think, because it takes some attention off what's happening in Gaza. To have this other theater against a nuclear power, it does siphon off a lot of the foreign policy discussion when some people are looking the other way outside of what's happening in Gaza, which is a genocide. That's what the U.S. is funding. So, hey, I'm with Macgregor here. Whether or not the U.S. government wants to pick a winner or loser and overthrow the government again and possibly get a replacement for Zelensky's to be seen. But there's no doubt these protests are significant, and the best solution to end this whole thing is to get the U.S. out. Stop the aid, withdraw all military resources from Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, and get this thing over with. Americans can't afford it. We don't want it. It's not our fight. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Is Macgregor right? What do these protests in Kiev mean, and how long do you see that this war will drag out for? I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Stephen Gardner too. I really appreciated this interview from him. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can support the channel, which I'll appreciate. And in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys again later, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.